Imagine standing across from a man who has already accepted his own death. He doesn't move, he doesn't speak, he doesn't look angry. He simply looks at you with a calmness that is terrifying because you know that nothing you do can intimidate him. You are fighting for your life, but he is just doing a job. This is the specific psychological weight that Miyamoto Musashi brought to a duel. History remembers him as a swordsman who won over 60 life-or-death engagements in feudal Japan. But if you look closer at his writings, specifically the work he left behind just weeks before his death, you realize that his sword was the least dangerous thing about him. The true weapon was his understanding of human psychology. Musashi discovered that most people defeat themselves long before a weapon is ever drawn. They are defeated by their own internal architecture. He identified specific behaviors, mental habits, that drain a person's power. And while he wrote this in the 17th century, these habits are actually more prevalent today than they were in the violent era of the samurai. The stakes have changed. We aren't dodging blades, but we are navigating a landscape designed to exploit these exact weaknesses. Most people assume Musashi was just physically faster or stronger than his opponents. That is the comfortable assumption. But historical accounts suggest something different. He was often disheveled. He used wooden practice swords against steel blades. He arrived late. He didn't play by the rules of honor that bound other samurai. He understood that honor, when it becomes a rigid need for validation, is a weakness. This brings us to the first critical insight Musashi offered about the fragile male ego, and it centers on the addiction to approval. In his final text, Dokudo, or The Path of Aloneness, Musashi wrote a simple instruction: never seek to be loved by everyone. On the surface, this sounds like standard Stoic advice, but look at the mechanism behind it.
Musashi realized that the moment you require external validation to feel stable, you have handed the keys to your emotional state to someone else. You become a slave to their opinion. In the modern world, we see this amplified by technology. We have built entire digital ecosystems based on the dopamine hit of approval. Neuroscience suggests that the chemical reward we get from a like or a compliment utilizes the same pathways as substance addiction. When you chase that feeling, you are not making decisions based on what is right or effective. You are making decisions based on what will be applauded. Musashi viewed this as a fatal tactical error. If an opponent knows you need to look good, they can bait you. They can make you overextend. They can manipulate your pride. A man who needs to be liked is easily controlled. A man who is indifferent to applause is virtually unshakable. This leads directly to the second weakness, which acts as a silent killer of potential. It is the refusal to accept reality as it is. Musashi wrote, "Accept everything just the way it is." This sounds passive, but it is actually the most aggressive mental stance you can take. Most of us spend our days arguing with reality. We wish things were easier. We wish the economy was better. We wish people were kinder. We complain about the unfairness of our circumstances. Musashi taught that this mental energy is waste. While you are wishing the situation was different, your opponent, whether that is a rival, a market force, or a difficult challenge, is maneuvering. Acceptance in this context doesn't mean resignation. It means seeing the chessboard clearly. It means saying, this is the situation. It is cold. I am outnumbered. I am tired. Now, what is the best move? When you strip away the emotional narrative of why is this happening to me, you are left with pure data, and data is what allows you to survive. But here is where the risk quietly increases, because even if you stop seeking
approval, and even if you accept reality, there is a third trap that catches almost everyone. It is the slavery to impulse. Musashi was explicit about this. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. We live in an economy that is entirely designed to monetize your lack of impulse control. Fast food, infinite scrolling, on-demand entertainment, substances. These industries rely on the fact that your primitive brain wants comfort now. Musashi viewed a man controlled by his desires as no better than an animal. If you are hungry, you eat. If you are angry, you yell. If you are horny, you chase. There is no gap between the stimulus and the response. To the samurai, this lack of a gap meant death. If an enemy can predict that you will chase a lure, he can lead you into a trap. In modern life, if you cannot control your impulse for comfort, you will never do the difficult work required to build something of value. You will always choose the sofa over the gym, or the distraction over the deep work. Musashi didn't just talk about this, he radicalized his life to root out these weaknesses. This is the part of the story that is often romanticized but rarely understood. After establishing his reputation, Musashi didn't retire to a comfortable court position, although he could have. He chose the path of the Ronin, the masterless samurai. He walked away from civilization. He spent years living in caves, wandering through mountains, often in complete isolation. Why would a successful man do that? He wasn't punishing himself. He was conducting an experiment. He understood that we use other people as buffers. We use noise, relationships, and social status to drown out our own insecurities. When you are alone in a cave, with no audience and no comfort, you cannot hide from yourself. In that silence, Musashi confronted what we might call the inner demons. The first demon is doubt. It's the voice that asks, "Who do you think you are?" Without friends to reassure you, you have to answer that question yourself. The second demon is dependency, the realization of how much you rely on others for your basic sense of safety. The third demon is fear, not just fear of death, but fear of irrelevance. Musashi's method was to sit with these demons until they lost their power. He didn't distract himself, he stared at them. This process is what he called forging. Just as steel is folded and hammered to remove impurities, the human mind must be subjected to the heat of solitude to remove the neediness. But there is a specific technique he used during this time that transforms this from abstract philosophy into a practical tool. It is the ritual of living death. Every morning, Musashi would visualize his own end. This wasn't a depressing exercise, it was a strategic one. He would imagine the sword cutting him. He would imagine his life ending. By exposing his brain to the worst-case scenario repeatedly, the fear response began to dull. Think about how much of your life is dictated by fear. Fear of embarrassment, fear of losing your job, fear of rejection. These fears constrain your movement. They make you hesitate. Musashi found that once you have mentally accepted the ultimate loss, your own life, the smaller losses stop mattering. If you aren't afraid to die, you certainly aren't afraid to ask for a raise, or approach a stranger, or start a business. The fear of death is the root system. All other anxieties are just branches. If you cut the root, the branches wither. This psychological restructuring created a man who was fundamentally different from his peers. When Musashi eventually returned to civilization, the change was visible. Opponents mentioned a strange phenomenon. They said that looking into his eyes was like looking into an abyss. There was no anxiety there. There was no eagerness to prove himself. There was just a void. And this terrified them. Human beings are used to reading microexpressions. We look for fear or anger in our opponent to gauge
How to react. When you face someone who reflects nothing back at you, someone who has killed their own ego, it creates a cognitive dissonance. You start to panic because you can't read them. Musashi won fights before he drew his sword because his opponents defeated themselves trying to figure him out. But this state of mind wasn't just for combat. Musashi codified this into a set of principles, the laws of invincibility, which he believed were necessary for anyone attempting to walk this path. He didn't write these laws for the average person. He knew the average person would prefer the comfort of their illusions. He wrote them for those who were willing to destroy their old selves to build something durable. The first law he established was that solitude is the ultimate truth-teller. Most men run from being alone because they don't like the company they keep when no one else is around. Musashi argued that you must learn to stand entirely on your own 2 feet, physically and emotionally.
This leads to a counterintuitive realization about strength. We often think of strength as adding things, adding muscle, adding skills, adding allies. Musashi viewed strength as subtraction. He began subtracting everything that wasn't essential. He stopped worrying about his appearance. He stopped worrying about social standing. He stopped worrying about the future. What was left was a concentrated, undistracted presence. And this brings us to the moment where his philosophy was put to the ultimate test. It is the most famous duel in Japanese history against Sasaki Kojiro. Kojiro was the opposite of Musashi. He was elegant, celebrated by the courts, and wielded a long, perfectly crafted blade called the drying pole. He was the establishment. He was the image of success. Musashi was the outlier. The duel was set to take place on a remote island, and this is where Musashi's understanding of the need for approval versus tactical reality played out in real time. All
officials were waiting. Kojiro was waiting. The sun was rising high, and Musashi was nowhere to be found. He was late. Kojiro began to pace. He felt disrespected. His anger started to rise. The crowd grew restless. They thought Musashi had fled out of fear. But Musashi hadn't fled. He was on a boat, moving slowly toward the island. He wasn't late because he was disorganized. He was late because he knew Kojiro was an impatient man who prided himself on etiquette. By being late, Musashi was attacking Kojiro's mind before he ever attacked his body. On that boat, Musashi did something that baffled the boatman. He didn't check his steel sword. Instead, he took a spare oar from the boat and began carving it with a knife. He was fashioning a crude wooden sword. Why? Kojiro's sword was famous for its length. It gave him a reach advantage over anyone. Musashi calculated that by carving the oar, he could create a weapon exactly a few inches longer than Kojiro's blade. He wasn't worried about how it looked. He wasn't worried about the honor of using a proper weapon. He was focused purely on the physics of the engagement. When the boat finally hit the sand, the tension on the beach was explosive. Kojiro was enraged. He shouted at Musashi for his lateness. Musashi stepped off the boat, looking calm, holding a piece of wood. He looked at the furious, elegant samurai in front of him, and he knew he had already won. Kojiro had lost control of his emotions. He was reacting. He was desperate to punish Musashi for the insult. Musashi was simply present. This moment perfectly encapsulates the difference between the weak man who is ruled by his ego and the strong man who rules himself. Kojiro had all the external trappings of power, the clothes, the reputation, the fine steel. But he was fragile because his composure depended on Musashi behaving a certain way. Musashi had no external trappings, but he was unbreakable because his composure depended on nothing. The duel itself
lasted only moments. But the lesson it teaches is about to shift how you view your own conflicts. Most people today are playing Kojiro's game. They are polished, they follow the rules, and they get angry when the world doesn't respect them. They are waiting for the world to arrive on time. Musashi's advice to the modern man is to stop waiting. Stop expecting the world to be polite. But the story doesn't end on that beach. In fact, the most profound shift in Musashi's life happened after he became invincible. After he proved he couldn't be beaten, he changed his definition of winning entirely. And this is the part that most history books gloss over, but it is the key to the entire philosophy. He spent the last 2 decades of his life proving that violence was actually the lowest form of power. After killing the greatest swordsman of his age with a piece of wood, Musashi slowly stopped using steel blades in duels. He began to carry only a wooden bokken. This wasn't because he had become a pacifist. It was because he had reached a level of skill where he no longer needed to kill an opponent to defeat them. He could control the distance and the timing so perfectly that he could strike a man, incapacitate him, or humiliate him without ending his life. This is the evolution from a warrior to a master. A warrior proves he can destroy. A master proves he can control. And this is where the advice sounds right, but can still be dangerous if you misunderstand it.
Musashi didn't stop killing because he wanted to be nice. He stopped because he realized that true strength is the ability to impose your will on the world without letting the world impose its chaos on you. If you have to kill everyone who disagrees with you or challenges you, you are still reacting to them. You are still caught in the cycle of action and reaction. When you can subdue an opponent without drawing blood, you have transcended the conflict. You are operating on a higher plane of reality than they are.
This leads us to the secret code that Musashi began to embody, and it is the direct opposite of how most men operate today. The first component of this code is the concept that the way is in everything. Musashi didn't just stay a swordsman, he became a master calligrapher, a painter, and a sculptor. In the West, we tell people to stay in their lane or specialize. Musashi argued that once you understand the principles of discipline, timing, and strategy in one field, you can map them onto anything. If you are disciplined in the gym, that discipline should bleed into your finances. If you are strategic in your business, that strategy should bleed into your relationships. The weak man compartmentalizes. He is disciplined at work, but a slob at home. He is charming to strangers, but cruel to his family. This creates a fractured psyche. Musashi taught that you must be the same man in every room. Integrity isn't just a moral word, it is a structural one. It means you are solid, whole, and consistent. But here is the part most people miss about his later years. Musashi identified a specific psychological trap that keeps men weak, regardless of their skills. It is the competition to not lose. He realized that 90% of men aren't playing to win, they are playing to avoid humiliation. They don't start the business because they don't want to look foolish if it fails. They don't approach the woman because they don't want the sting of rejection. They don't speak their truth because they fear conflict. This is the mindset of prey. Prey animals move to avoid death. Predators move to secure a meal. Musashi lived entirely in the predator mindset. He didn't fear losing. In fact, in his text, The Book of Five Rings, he discusses the necessity of taking risks that seem insane to the average person. He writes about becoming the enemy. This means projecting yourself into their mind, seeing the world through their eyes, and realizing they are just as afraid as you are.
When you realize the rest of the world is operating out of fear, you stop being intimidated by titles, money, or status. You realize these are just costumes people wear to hide their own trembling hands. This brings us to a brutal thought experiment that Musashi essentially lived out, and one you can use today to test your own strength. Imagine you lost everything tomorrow: your job, your bank account, your reputation, your social circle. You are dropped in a new city with nothing but the clothes on your back. Would you still be a strong man? For most men, the answer is no. Their confidence is tied to their car, their job title, or the number of people who know their name. If you strip those props away, they collapse. They don't know who they are without their external validation. Musashi stripped himself of everything voluntarily. He walked around unwashed, without a home, without a lord to serve, and yet he remained the most dangerous man in Japan. His strength was intrinsic. It was built into his nervous system, not his bank account. This is the ultimate goal of his philosophy, to build a self that is anti-fragile. When you rely on external things to feel strong, you are fragile, because those things can be taken away. When you rely on your own ability to endure, to adapt, and to solve problems, you become unbreakable. But how do you actually apply this in a modern world where you can't just wander the woods with a sword? It starts with what Musashi called the stance of no stance. In sword fighting, if you hold your sword in a rigid, fixed position, the enemy knows exactly how to attack you. If you hold it loosely, ready to move in any direction, you are unpredictable. Mentally, most men hold a rigid stance. They have a fixed idea of how their life should be. I should be married by 30. I should be making this much money. I should be respected. When reality hits this rigid structure, when a breakup happens or a layoff occurs, the structure shatters.
The man breaks down. Musashi teaches us to have a fluid mind. Water takes the shape of the container. If you pour water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you pour it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow, or it can crash, but it never breaks.
The strong man adapts. If the market changes, he learns a new skill. If a relationship ends, he learns the lesson and moves on. He doesn't waste energy complaining that the container changed. He just flows into the new form. This leads to the final, and perhaps most spiritual, aspect of his teachings, the void. In his final scroll, the Book of the Void, Musashi writes, "By knowing things that exist, you can know that which does not exist." This sounds abstract, but it is deeply practical. He is talking about the power of silence and the unsaid. In a negotiation, the person who speaks the least often holds the most power. In a crisis, the person who remains the calmest dictates the outcome. The void is the space you create when you stop frantically reacting to everything. Weak men are loud. They fill the silence because they are anxious. They brag because they feel small. They explain themselves because they crave understanding. Strong men are comfortable in the void. They don't need to explain. They don't need to brag. They let their actions carry the weight. This creates a paradox that governs human social dynamics. When you stop needing something, you become magnetic to it. Musashi discovered that when he stopped caring about fame, his legend grew. When he stopped caring about death, his life was preserved. In your life, you will find this is consistently true. The man who is desperate for a relationship repels women. The man who is desperate for a sale scares away clients. The neediness smells like fear. But the man who is content in his own solitude, who is working on his own purpose, who validates himself, that man becomes a gravity well. People want to be near him because he feels stable. He feels like
a rock in a chaotic ocean. Musashi's life asks you to make a choice. It is not an easy choice, and it is not a comfortable one. The choice is between the path of the herd and the path of the solitary walker. The herd offers safety. It offers validation. It tells you that you are good if you follow the rules, buy the products, and seek the applause. But the price of admission is your freedom. You have to constantly perform for the approval of others. The path of the solitary walker, Musashi's path, offers no applause. It guarantees discomfort. It promises that you will have to face your own demons without distraction. But the reward is ownership. You get to own your mind. You get to own your time. You get to own your soul. Musashi died in a cave, kneeling upright, leaning on his sword. He didn't die surrounded by weeping fans or piles of gold. He died alone, in silence. But he died with a clean conscience, knowing he had mastered the only thing that matters, himself. He left us the Dokodo, his 21 laws, as a map, but he cannot walk the path for you. You have to look at your life today, at your phone addiction, at your need for praise, at your fear of failure, and ask yourself if you are living as a warrior or as a casualty. Are you forging your spirit, or are you just consuming comfort? If you have listened this far, you know the answer you want to give, but wanting isn't enough. The sword doesn't forge itself. You have to apply the heat. So here is the challenge. For the next week, practice just one of Musashi's principles. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. When you feel the impulse to distract yourself, to eat junk, to scroll, to seek easy comfort, stop. Sit with the discomfort, watch it, control it. Prove to yourself that you are the master of the house, not the guest, because as Musashi showed us, a man who conquers himself is greater than a man who conquers 1,000 enemies. The path is open, the choice is yours, walk it.